Good day, everyone. I am Angela Marie Aipal, and I will be the reporter of conditioning to psychotherapy of Skinner. Conditioning. So, Skinner recognized two types of conditioning, which is classical and operant. Classical is a behavior which is elicited from the organism. Elicited meaning is nakakuha ta og response gikan sa organism. Mao pong gitawag siya ni Skinner og respondent conditioning because a response is drawn out from the organism by a specific identifiable stimulus. So if we show a stimulus that can affect the subject, we can get a response from it. The next type of conditioning is the operant conditioning, wherein a behavior is emitted from the organism. Emit is something na nagpakita nga response from the organism. Unlike sa classical, nga naay stimulus aron makuha ta siya nga response. Operant is also called Skinnerian conditioning. It is a behavior that is made more likely to recur when it is immediately reinforced. So, mubalik ang isa ka behavior if na-reinforce dayon siya. Classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, a neutral or conditioned stimulus is paired with that is immediately precedes an unconditioned stimulus a number of times until it is capable of bringing about a previously unconditioned response, now called the conditioned response. So classical conditioning is naay duha ka stimulus, conditioned and unconditioned. Unahon og pakita ang conditioned stimulus sa organism, sunod ang unconditioned stimulus. Balik-balikon siya nga process hantod sa makakuha og conditioned nga reaction or response sa organism. So if ang ipakita na is ang conditioned stimulus, makonect dayon sa organism na ang kaning conditioned daay nga stimulus, although sa start is unconditioned ang response sa organism, mahimo siyang conditioned response tungod sa misunod nga unconditioned stimulus. So an early example of classical conditioning with humans was described by John Watson and Rosalie Rayner in 1920 and involved a young boy, Albert B., usually referred to as Little Albert. So si Little Albert, tong 9 months old pa siya, is wala pa siya ginapakita nga fear sa mga animals or furry objects. But when he became the subject for classical conditioning, he later on showed fear in the things that he previously did not fear. Little Albert was shown a conditioned stimulus, which is a white rat, and an unconditioned stimulus, which is a sudden loud sound. That loud sound came from a bar being struck by the experimenter behind Little Albert's head. Whenever Little Albert tries to touch the white mice presented to him, an experimenter will strike the bar and scaring Little Albert. After a week nga balik-balik ato nga procedure, the white mice is presented to Little Albert without the sudden loud sound. By that time, Little Albert had learned to fear the rat, and after a few days, the experimenters presented Albert with some blocks. Little Albert showed no fear on the blocks, but when the mice is presented to him, he would show fear. Even on things that is not the white mice, but held characteristics like the white mice, Little Albert would cry and crawl away. However, this experiment was never completed because of Little Albert's mother's intervention. Although classical conditioning is responsible for some human learning, Skinner believed that most human behaviors are learned through operant conditioning. So, ang key to operant conditioning is kailangan dayon ma-reinforce ang isa ka response. Shaping. Shaping is a procedure in which the experimenter or the environment first rewards gross approximations of the behavior, then closer approximations, and finally the desired behavior itself. Through this process of reinforcing successive approximations, the experimenter or the environment gradually shapes the final complex set of behaviors. So, the desired behavior must be shaped first by the environment to emit the behavior without complexities. Kailangan muna i-break down into simple segments ang isa ka complex behavior para ma-achieve ang katong desired nga behavior. For example is the training of a severely mentally challenged boy to dress himself. The parent will reward the boy a candy if he is about to complete the task of dressing up correctly. If an attempt is successful, there would be no need to reinforce. Quite apparently, The child can reach the final target behavior only if the parent breaks up the complex behavior into its component parts and then reinforces successive approximations to each response. In this example, as in all instances of operant conditioning, three conditions are present: the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So the antecedent is the environment or setting kung asa nahitabo ang behavior. Sa example is naa sa balay ang katong bata. Next is the behavior. Dapat sulod sa makaya sa boy ang response and must not be interfered with by competing or antagonistic behaviors. The consequence is the reward, which is the candy. Operant discrimination. Skinner claimed that discrimination is not an ability that we possess, but a consequence of our reinforcement history. Kada isa sa ato natay history of being reinforced, and mo-react daw ta sa uban elements na sa environment nato, pero dili sa uban. So, for example, we do not come to the dinner table because we discern that the food is ready. Niadto lang daw ta kay na-reinforce na ta from our previous experiences nga mo-react in that way. Stimulus generalization, a response to a similar environment in the absence of previous reinforcement. So example is nagpalit og ticket ang isa ka tao for a rock concert, pero wala siya kabalo kung kinsa ang mag-perform. But naingnan siya nga similar ang rock group nga iyang gipalitan og ticket sa iyang favorite nga rock group. Technically, dili daw naga-generalize ang mga tao from one situation to another. Rather, naga-react sila to a new situation in the same manner nga ilang buhat atong mas nauna pa. Reinforcement. According to Skinner, reinforcement has two effects. It strengthens the behavior and it rewards the person. But dili tanan behavior nga gina-reinforce is rewarding or pleasing to the person. Positive reinforcement. Any stimulus that, when added to a situation, increases the probability that a given behavior will occur is termed a positive reinforcer. So for example, kung tubig sa gripo sa inyong kusina kay tinaw, then that behavior is going to be strengthened kay ang natungag man is a beneficial environmental stimulus. Also, haphazard ang reinforcement sa humans kay wala siya direction and therefore learning is inefficient. Then, dapat ma-determine kung unsay consequences sa reinforcing ug sa uban nga dili pag mag-condition og humans. Kay depending on personal history, spankings and scoldings might be reinforcing, and kisses and compliments might be punishing. Negative reinforcement. The removal of an aversive stimulus from a situation also increases the probability that the preceding behavior will occur. This removal results in negative reinforcement. By removing something unpleasant, it will strengthen the behavior. So for example, if gigutom ka, then kailangan nimo mukaon para mawala ang kagutom. Punishment. By the way, negative reinforcement should not be confused with punishment. Kaya ang negative reinforcers naga-remove, reduce or avoid og aversive stimuli, wherein ang punishment mismo ang presentation sa aversive stimuli. Ang negative reinforcer naga-strengthen og response while ang punishment kay dili. Though dili niya gina-strengthen ang response, dili pud ingon nga ginawikan niya to. So effects of punishment. Punishment ordinarily is imposed to prevent people from acting in a particular way. When it is successful, people will stop behaving in that manner, but they still must do something. What they do cannot be accurately predicted because punishment does not tell them what they should do. It merely suppresses the tendency to behave in the undesirable fashion. An effect of punishment is to suppress a behavior. Ginapugnan niya itong behavior nga maong reason nga gipunish siya. Second is conditioning of a negative feeling. If strong enough ang punishment to instigate a response, maka-elicit og classical conditioning a response and ang negative emotion ang maka-prevent nga mausab to nga behavior. Last is the spread of its effects. Anything nga involve ato nga punishment kay either magdevelop og negative feelings or mo-avoid or palayo. The inappropriate behavior serves the purpose of preventing future punishment. and ang Freudian defense mechanisms can be an effective means of avoiding pain and its attendant anxiety. Punishment and reinforcement compared. Punishment has several characteristics in common with reinforcement. Just as there are two kinds of reinforcements, positive and negative, there are two types of punishment. The first requires the presentation of an aversive stimulus. The second involves the removal of a positive reinforcer. These two types of punishment reveal a second characteristic common to punishment and reinforcement. Both can derive either from natural consequences or from human imposition. Finally, both punishment and reinforcement are means of controlling behavior, whether the control is by design or by accident. So reinforcement and punishment have two kinds or types. They are the same ng characteristics is nakuha from natural or with the involvement of humans, and that these two are means or gamiton to control a behavior. Conditioned and generalized reinforcers. Conditioned reinforcers, or sometimes called secondary reinforcers, are those environmental stimuli that are not by nature satisfying, but become so because they are associated with such unlearned or primary reinforcers as food, water, sex, or physical comfort. Ang conditioned reinforcer kay environmental stimuli nga dili gud siya makasatisfy pero mahimo na lang kay naka-associate sa mga primary reinforcers. Tas ang kwarta is a conditioned reinforcer kay pwede ma-exchange og lahi-lahi nga mga primary reinforcer. Ginatawag pud ni siya nga generalized reinforcer kay dili lang isa kundi daghan nga primary reinforcer ang ma-associate. Then naay 5 ka generalized reinforcer nga naga-sustain sa human behavior, which is ang attention, approval, affection, submission of others, and tokens or money. So for example, ang attention kay conditioned generalized reinforcer kay naka-associate siya sa duha ka primary reinforcer nga food o physical contact. Naay duha ka schedules of reinforcement: continuous schedule and intermittent schedules. Continuous schedule is the organism is reinforced for every response. This type of schedule increases the frequency of a response but is an inefficient use of the reinforcer. So gina-reinforce kada naay response ang organism hantod sa managhan ang frequency sa response. Then intermittent schedules are based either on the behavior of the organism or an elapsed time. They either can be set at a fixed rate or can vary according to a randomized program. So mas prefer ni Skinner ang intermittent schedules kay resistant to extinction ang mga responses. Kaya naga-base ang schedule sa behavior sa organism or sa actual time nga nagamit. Then maset sad ang schedule at a fixed rate or by random. Then daghan og reinforcement schedules ang na-recognize nila Forster and Skinner. Pero naay upat ka basic intermittent schedules which are the fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Fixed ratio. With a fixed ratio schedule, the organism is reinforced intermittently according to the number of responses it makes. Ratio refers to the ratio of responses to reinforcers. So ang fixed ratio kay ang kadaghanon sa response. So for example, rewardan og green pellet sa experimenter ang kalapati kada ikalimang nga peck sa disk. So ma-conditioned ang kalapati with a ratio of 5:1. Also, dapat gamay sa daw sa sugod ang rate kung high fixed ratio schedules ang gamiton. Dapat magkaanam ang pagdako sa rate. Variable ratio. With a fixed ratio schedule, the organism is reinforced after every nth response. With the variable ratio schedule, it is reinforced after the nth response on the average. So mag-base sa average nth response bago i-reinforce. By the way, ang training daw kay dapat mag-start with continuous reinforcement then sunod kay low response number hantod sa i-increase to higher rate ang response. So just like earlier, rewardan ng kalapati kada ikatulong nga response. So on average, nasiya VR6 nga schedule, sunod kay VR10 and so on, hantod sa magkadako ang responses para ma-prevent ang extinction. Fixed interval. With a fixed interval schedule, the organism is reinforced for the first time following a designated period of time. So for example, F15 kay nag-indicate nga girewardan ng organism sa una nga response niya kada 5-minute nga interval. Variable interval. A variable interval schedule is one in which the organism is reinforced after the lapse of random or varied periods of time. So ang organism kay gina-reinforce in a random length interval or periods of time. Extinction. So mga learned nga responses can be lost for at least 4 reasons. First, they can simply be forgotten during the passage of time. Second, and more likely, they can be lost due to the interference of preceding or subsequent learning. So nawala kay naay nauna or nisunod nga learning na pud. Third, they can disappear due to punishment. So dili na usbo ng response kay gi-punish. And fourth cause of lost learning is extinction, defined as the tendency of a previously acquired response to become progressively weakened upon non-reinforcement. So nawala kay wala na na-reinforce og balik pa. Operant extinction. Operant extinction takes place when an experimenter systematically withholds reinforcement of a previously learned response until the probability of that response diminishes to 0. Rate of operant extinction depends largely on the schedule of reinforcement under which learning occurred. So kituya sa experimenter nga iundang sa ang reinforcement para mawala to siya nga response sa organism. Human organism. Skinner's view was that an understanding of the behavior of laboratory animals can generalize to human behavior, just as physics can be used to interpret what is observed in outer space, and just as an understanding of basic genetics can help in interpreting complex evolutionary concepts. So, Skinner generalized the behavior of humans and animals, just like in physics and genetics. And he also agreed with John Watson na dapat ang psychology kay nakakonfine sa scientific study of observable phenomena, namely behavior. Nag-ingon sa si Skinner nga magsugod sa simple bago ang complex. Maupod nga una siya og study sa mga behavior sa animals bago sa mga psychotics, sa mentally challenged children, other children, and finally sa complex behavior of adults. So na daw tulo ka forces ang nag-shape sa human behavior o human personality. Number 1, natural selection. Number 2, cultural practices. And 3, the individual's history of reinforcement. And from his quote, it is all a matter of natural selection, since operant conditioning is an evolved process, of which cultural practices are special applications. Natural selection. Human personality is the product of a long evolutionary history. As individuals, our behavior is determined by genetic composition and especially by our personal histories of reinforcement. As a species, however, we are shaped by the contingencies of survival. Natural selection plays an important part in human personality. So, ang individual behavior nga reinforcing tends to be repeated. Throughout history, ang katong mga behaviors na beneficial daw sa species tends to survive. So, for example, gina-favor sa natural selection ng mga individual nga ma-dilate or ma-contract nila ilang pupils pag ma-change ang lighting. So, their superior ability na makakita during daylight or nighttime enable them to avoid life-threatening dangers and survive the age of reproduction. The contingencies of reinforcement and the contingencies of survival interact, and some behaviors that are individually reinforcing also contribute to the survival of the species. So for example, sexual behavior is generally reinforcing to an individual and has a natural selection value. Kaya katong individuals na kusog og arousal sa sexual stimulation, sila pod most likely magka-offspring nga naasay similar patterns sa behavior. So, cultural evolution. Ano si Skinner nga ang culture naga-shape sa human personality, and selection ang responsible kung anong nakasurvive ang mga cultural practices. And that selection also plays a key role in humans' evolutionary history and also with the contingencies of reinforcement. People do not observe particular practices in order that the group will be more likely to survive. They observe them because groups that induce their members to do so survived and transmitted them. So mag-observe sila og practices dili ingon aron maka-survive, but because naay mga kuan nga members sa ilang group nga naka-survive na tas gi-transmit sa ila. In other words, humans do not make a cooperative decision to do what is best for the society, but those societies whose members behaved cooperatively tended to survive. So internal states can be observed just like any other behavior, but it is limited. Skinner wrote that if we talk about private events, we can establish limits. Then this might bring the non-observables within reach. Inner states are those feelings of love, anxiety, or fear. Self-awareness is an inner state. It is private. Each of us is aware of our own thoughts, feelings, recollections, and intentions. Humans have consciousness but also aware they have consciousness. They are aware of the environment but also aware they are part in the environment. They can observe stimuli but also aware that they are observing that stimuli. Drives. So, dili daw makakause of behavior ang drives. And Skinner said that it is only the effects of deprivation and satiation. So, if you deprive a person of food, then ma-increase ang likelihood ng mukaon siya. But if isatiate na nimo ang person, then that decreases the likelihood of eating. If kabalo ang mga psychologists about the 3 essentials of behavior, they will know nga nung nagbehave og ingana ang isa ka tao. So, untestable hypothesis ang drives and needs. Emotions. So, ato si Skinner nga dili daw i-attribute ang emotions sa behavior. Gi-account niya ang contingencies of survival and contingencies of reinforcement sa emotions. So, sa survival, those individuals nga kusog og fear or anger, sila to ang naka-escape or triumph over danger, and they will pass on these characteristics to their offspring. So, on an individual level, ang mga pleasant emotions tend to be reinforced, and the probability of these behaviors recurring will increase in that life of the individual. Purpose and intention. So, Skinner also cautioned of attributing behavior to them. Both exist inside the skin, and they are not subject to direct outside scrutiny. A felt ongoing purpose may itself be reinforcing. So for example, imong gituuhan nga purpose sa pagjogging is to feel better and live longer. Then kana nga hunahuna ang mag-act as a reinforcing stimulus. Intention. If mag-intend ang isa ka tawo nga mag-watch og movie pagka Friday, that is because watching films is reinforcing. Pagpadulong niya og watch sa movie, maka-feel siya og physical condition sa iyang lawas. Then mao na to ang ginatawag nga intention. So in intention and purpose, there are physically felt stimuli within the organism, and dili siya mentalistic events responsible for behavior. Complex behavior. So ang human behavior is very complex daw siya. Pero nag-believe si Skinner nga even ang mga abstract or complex behavior kay shaped through natural selection, cultural evolution, or individual's history of reinforcement. So, higher mental processes. Ang human thought daw ang pinakalisod i-analyze sa tanan behaviors, but there is a potential that it can be understood as long as dili ta mo resort sa hypothetical fiction such as mind. Ang thinking, problem solving, o reminiscing kay covert behaviors na nag-take place sulod sa skin pero dili sa mind. For example, ang searching behavior kay dugay na na-reinforce every time na atay nawala nga gamit. Also, if dili ma-recall ang name sa isa ka acquaintance, pangitaon niya ang name covertly. However, dili na jud mahinumduman ang pangalan sa acquaintance unlike sa nawala nga gamit. And ang problem solving kay involve sa covert behavior, tas kailangan sad na covert ang pagmanipulate sa mga variables hantod sa makita na ang tama nga solution. Creativity. Dili mag-exist ang creative behavior kung ang mga predictable responses lang ang magpakita pag naihatag nga stimulus. If you compare ang creative behavior sa evolutionary theory, it is only natural in the selection nga naay kalahian sa mga species same as sa behavior without recourse to a personal creative mind. Importante mutation sa natural selection o creative behavior. Kay ang ma-produce nga random or accidental condition ang dako ang possibility ana na makasurvive. And creativity daw ang result sa random or accidental behaviors which happens to be rewarded. The fact na naay uban tao na mas creative pa sa uban kay tungod sa kalahian sa ilang genetic endowment and experiences nga nag-shape sa ilang creative behavior. Unconscious behavior. So because rarely lang gina-observe ang genetic ug environmental variables ug ilang behavior, halos tanan daw sa atong behavior kay unconsciously motivated. Matawag daw nga unconscious ang isa ka behavior kung dili na mahuna-hunaan sa tao tungod kay ilang gisuppress kay na-punish sila. Ang behavior na naay aversive nga consequence kay naay tendency nga i-ignore or dili huna-hunaon. For example, kung ang bata kay permanently gina-punish for doing sexual play, i-suppress sa bata ang sexual behavior, tas i-repress ang thoughts or memories atong activity, hantod sa i-deny na sa bata nga nahitabo to siya. The denial is an aversive aspect, connected with thoughts of punishment and is thus a negative reinforcer. So the child is rewarded for not thinking about certain sexual behaviors. Dreams. Dreams daw are covert and symbolic forms sa behavior. And Skinner agreed with Freud nga ang dreams kay nagaserve as wish fulfillment purpose. So magpakita sa dreams ang gina-repress nga sexual or aggressive stimuli. Kay kung i-act out siya, pwede maka-receive og punishment, tas bisag hunaon lang nimo kay naay punitive effects. Pero kung kani mga behaviors magpakita sa dream, walay kaakibat nga punishment, then through symbols ang pag-express ato nga behavior. Social behavior. Individuals lang daw ang naga-behave tas dili ang group. Nag-establish lang og groups kay naay reward like kung mapil ka og isa ka clan, pwede maprotektahan sa mga animals, sa mga sakuna or sa mga kaaway. Dili always reinforcing ang pag-apil og mga social groups, pero naay at least tulo ka reason nga naay uban tao magstay sa group. First, mag-remain sila bisag ginaabuso na sila kay naay mga naga-reinforce sa ilaha. Second, kay ang uban tao walay kakayahan muhawa sa grupo, especially ang mga bata. Third, after ginaabuso kay naay schedule kung kano sa hatagan og reward, so dili makahawa ang tao, labi na og ang positive reinforcement kay mas labaw pa sa punishment na nadawat. Control of human behavior. Ang behaviors individual kay controlled by environmental contingencies. The contingencies may have been erected by society, another individual, or by oneself. Pero ang environment ang responsible sa behavior og dili ang free will. Social control. Individuals form social groups because it tends to be reinforcing. Groups then exercise control sa mga members nila through laws, rules, and customs. Ang laws sa nation, rules sa organization, ug customs sa culture are powerful variables that controls the lives of their members. A humorous example of unconscious behavior and social control is between Skinner and Fromm. Skinner would reinforce Fromm's arm-waving behavior. Depending on the action of Fromm's arms, Skinner would express different behaviors, and minutes after Skinner's selective reinforcement, Fromm did not know he was flailing his arm vigorously. So like Fromm, kada isa sa ato kay makontrol through social forces and techniques. One is operant conditioning, second kay describing contingencies, third is deprivation and satiation, and fourth is physical restraint. So maka-exercise og control ang society sa iyang members through operant conditioning using the four principal methods. Next, contingencies that are usually verbal. Ilahang i-inform ang tao sa mga consequences sa ilang behavior nga wala pa gani nahitabo. For example, threats and promises. Then, makontrol sad ang behavior sa tao kung ilang i-deprive or kuhaan, or satiating or punan sila og reinforcers. Lastly, makontrol ang tao through physical restraints, like putting lawbreakers in prison. Nasay uban nag-ingon nga gina-deny ang freedom sa individual aning physical restraint. Pero ana si Skinner nga walay labot ang personal freedom sa pag-shape sa behavior, kundi ang contingencies lang sa survival og social environment, pati na pod sa effects sa reinforcement. Self-control. Skinner said nga kaya sa tao nga i-manipula ang variables sa ilang environment mao maka-measure og self-control. Dili naga-reside ang contingencies of self-control sa individual, so pag i-control sa tao iyang sarili, ilang ginabuhat kay i-manipulate ang variables the same way nga gibuhat to nila sa pag-control sa laing tao. So naay pila ka techniques gigamit aron maka-exercise og self-control ang tao nga dili magsalig sa ilang free choice. First, pwede sila magamit og physical aids to alter their environment. For example, magdala og extra kwarta pag mag-shopping, aron pwede siya makapalit og pasing unsa or pwede pod dili. Second, i-change ang environment nila aron makuha ang desired behavior. For example, gusto mag-concentrate og study ang estudyante. Iyang palungon ng TV aron mawala ang disturbances. Third, ilahang i-arrange ang environment na makaproduce og proper response aron makalikay sa aversive stimulus. Like kung magtingog ang alarm which is an aversive sound, dapat mobangon jud aron palungon ng alarm. Fourth, mag-take sila og drugs or alcohol as a means of self-control. For example, mag-ingest og tranquilizer ang tao aron ma-placid iyang behavior. Fifth, lahi ang buhaton sa tao para malagkayan na mo behave in an undesirable fashion. For example, aron dili na maghuna-huna sa iyang mali nga binuhatan sa una ug magilty, mag-ihap na lang siya og mga patterns sa wallpaper. The unhealthy personality. So usahay daw makaproduce og detrimental effects ang mga techniques sa social control ug self-control, which is an inappropriate behavior ug unhealthy personality development. Counteracting strategies. Pag sobraan daw ang social control, people will counteract like escaping, revolting, or using passive resistance. Sa escape, magpalayo sa controlling agent ang tao either physically or psychologically. Sa revolt, mag-counterattack sila sa controlling agent, like mag-vandalize og public property, tormenting teachers, and etc. Sa passive resistance, ang conspicuous feature niya is stubbornness. For example, mangita og daghang rason ang bata kung nganong wala na human iyang homework. Inappropriate behaviors. Nagasunod ni siya gikan sa mga self-defeating nga techniques or failed attempts sa self-control. Labi na og naay kauban nga strong emotion. Inappropriate behaviors are excessive vigorous behavior and excessive restrained behavior. Excessive vigorous behavior kay dili mag-make sense, pero kuhaon ng past history kay mahimong reasonable kay nasabtan man nganong ing-ana iyang behavior. Ang excessive restrained behavior kay paglikay sa aversive stimuli nga naka-associate ato nga punishment. Another type sa inappropriate behavior kay blocking out reality. Dili na ang tao mag-pay og attention ato nga aversive stimuli. Then ikaupat nga form kay dili mao nga self-knowledge, thus mag-manifest into self-deluding responses like boasting, rationalizing, or claiming to be the Messiah. Another type of inappropriate behavior kay self-punishment. Either sila mismo mag-punish sa ilang sarili or magbuhat sila environmental variables para ma-punish sila sa laing tao. Psychotherapy. Nagabilib si Skinner nga apil sa mga dako nga obstacle sa paghimong scientific studies of psychology ang psychotherapy. Though iyahang mga ideas kay dako og tabang sa behavior therapy. Therapies are controlling agents, pero dili tanan controlling agents kay harmful, so kailangan makabalo ang patient kung kinsay punitive authority figures or permissive nga therapists. So in shaping behavior, nagatake jud siya og time apil na ang therapeutic behavior. Nagamold og desirable behavior ang therapist by reinforcing slightly improved changes in behavior. Ang non-behavioral therapist kay pwede niya maapektuhan ang behavior accidentally or unknowingly, while ang behavioral nga therapist kay iyahan ang field, since familiar naman siya sa mga technique nga ginagamit. Ang mga traditional therapists kay naga-resort of fictional constructs to explain behaviors. No therapeutic purpose is served by postulating explanatory fictions and internal causes. If ang inner cause ang nag-shape sa behavior, then dapat na ay force ang responsible sa inner cause, kaso dili siya ma-back-upan og scientific analysis. Pero ang behavior therapy kay moderetso na og deal sa history sa organism. Tas ang final analysis nga gikan dito sa history ang responsible for any hypothetical cause. Over the years, daghan na og nabuhat techniques ang mga behavior therapies nga based sa operant conditioning, though ang uban kay sa classical. Kan sila mga therapists ang nagakuan aning mga treatment processes, ang positive consequences of certain behavior and aversive effects, and also ang results sa positive reinforcement sa behaviors in the long run.